Hey, what's going on, guys? Earlier today, it was reported by Ariel Helwani that UFC Fight Night Saudi Arabia, which is set to take place on March 2nd, is going to be postponed until June. And I believe the reason for that postponement is a title defense from Islam Makhachev, the lightweight champion. And initially, if you've been watching my channel over the last couple months, I believed that Islam Makhachev would defend his lightweight title on March 2nd, which was the fight night in Saudi Arabia. And I actually believe there's still a chance that that card doesn't get postponed. It's not 100% official yet. This is supposedly what Ariel Helwani is hearing from sources, but the UFC has not come out and confirmed it yet. And that's what leads me to believe there is a chance the March 2nd card stays together, and even potentially Islam Makhachev could fight on that card. But we're going to talk about it at first as if it is postponed, as if it is confirmed. Because essentially what Ariel Helwani is saying is Saudi Arabia said, this card isn't good enough. This card isn't good enough. We don't want this card. We want a deeper card. So therefore, let's postpone it. UFC has a lot of big cards coming up. Let's postpone it till June, and let's get a big card in June. And if you've been watching the channel for a while, I've been talking about Islam Makhachev fighting in Saudi Arabia. It made perfect sense. And recently, after Dana White has come out and announced Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan on UFC 300, winner will take on Islam Makhachev in the summer. Supposedly, Islam Makhachev is injured, which I made a video on that as well. I don't really buy that as well. I think that was kind of something that was just said to maybe, convince Arman and Charles to sign the contracts. They were told, oh, Islam's injured. He can't fight till, summertime, so you guys can fight each other for number one contender. Also, maybe that's what they told Saudi Arabia as well, but Islam is out posting on Instagram stories, doing gymnastics, doing different training techniques. But anyway, I really, truly believe this is a product of UFC 298, UFC 299, and UFC 300. All three of these cards, and I know UFC 300 isn't official yet, all three of them are completely stacked. And when you have cards that are stacked this deep, right really close to each other, you end up getting a lot of Apex cards and low-level events. And the reason the UFC constantly goes to the UFC Apex is because they don't care about the quality of the card, because they don't need to sell tickets. And when you're going to somewhere like Saudi Arabia, which supposedly it's being reported that the UFC is being paid $20 million by Saudi Arabia to bring a card there, they're going to expect a very deep card. And that's not really what the UFC is willing to give them. If you look at the card right now as it stands, and I'll put it up on the screen, this isn't a great card at all. This is only 8 fights currently announced, but we're a month and a half away. Every fight really should be announced already. So unless you're throwing together fights last minute, right now your best fight is Alex Perez versus Islam Makhachev. And, Alex Perez barely shows up, so that fight may end up getting canceled anyway. Then you got Jairzinho Rozenstruik versus my body double, Shamil Gaziev. That's an okay fight, but right now as it stands, it's a main card fight. And then look at the rest of the card. Eric Anders, Jamie Pickett. That's not a very good fight. That's not even a good prelim. That should be opening up the card. And you look at the rest of the card, it's just not filled with very big names by any means. And I think Saudi Arabia is looking at that card, and they're like, you know what? We'd rather postpone it. We're paying you these big dollars. The UFC is probably, saying, oh, well, we got all these other cards going on. And also, I feel like the UFC sometimes, and I've talked about this with the ESPN deal, I think the UFC sometimes relies on different companies and different entities' ignorance to the sport, and they try to sell them wolf tickets. Like, oh, this is a badass card. You know how Dana comes on and, talks about all these fights. He'll pretend a fight's great when it's really not. And I think a lot of the time, whether it be with ESPN or with, other entities like different countries, they sell them on these big cards. And then if they're not necessarily deep, hardcore fans or really pay close attention to the sport, they can't necessarily, tell the difference at least that much between a massive card and a crappy card. But Saudi Arabia is smarter than that. Saudi Arabia knows, okay, this isn't a big card. And also for Saudi Arabia, they just want big names. They don't care. They want big names. And that's why I always thought, okay, most likely there's going to be a title fight on this card. And, we're waiting and waiting and waiting, and it's never getting announced. And Dana White even said at a press conference, well, most likely, so I think he said something along the lines of Saudi Arabia will not be a normal fight night card. Well, I'm looking at it right now, And honestly, it looks like an Apex card to me. And again, I know there's only 8 fights announced, but we're a month and a half out. Most guys like 8-week camps. You're at 6 weeks right now to the card, basically. So, and it's looking like an Apex card. The best fight, Alex Perez versus Islam Makhachev. Second best fight, Jairzinho Rozenstruik versus Shamil Gaziev. That's an Apex card. And I don't know what the UFC is planning to do in terms of the current card. Are they going to keep it together and then shift it to the Apex, similar to what they did with the China card, a couple months back? Or are they just going to cancel this card altogether, have an empty Saturday night, and then shift some of those fights to different cards, and then some of the fights like Makhachev and maybe Gaziev, maybe shift them to the June card, which would be in Saudi Arabia, which would be the new Saudi Arabia card, which could very well be a pay-per-view card. I wonder if the UFC will make the June card a pay-per-view, and then therefore maybe they can justify stacking it a little bit more. I don't know, because at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia is already kind of supplementing the pay-per-view sales, because that card's going to be on in the middle of the day to be prime time for the people in Saudi Arabia. So we see it all the time with Abu Dhabi. We get these stacked Abu Dhabi pay-per-views, but what happens is there's not a lot of pay-per-view sales because people aren't buying pay-per-views in the middle of the afternoon. But the UFC doesn't care because Abu Dhabi has struck a deal with them where they supplement the pay-per-view with millions upon millions of dollars. And then the UFC doesn't care about how many pay-per-view sales they have because they've already made that money from Abu Dhabi itself. And also, the pay-per-view sales themselves go straight to ESPN. ESPN is paying the UFC a flat rate. Now, the UFC does want to keep ESPN happy, but they have a card that's so stacked, even if it does okay pay-per-view sales, then, it's matching up with some of these other events like an Aljamain Sterling Henry Cejudo, or an Aljamain Sterling Sean O'Malley, or even a Leon Edwards Colby Covington, which I don't believe does that well. So if they're doing 300 to 500,000 pay-per-view buys, you get a stacked card in the middle of the afternoon, I would say you'd probably get at least 300 to 400,000 pay-per-view buys, even though it's a stacked card because it's on in the middle of the afternoon. So they kind of get the best of both worlds. So I'm wondering if the UFC shifts that card to June and then also makes it a pay-per-view, because there's been rumors of a pay-per-view headlined by Islam Makhachev in June, because recently Islam Makhachev, who's been adamant about wanting to fight, tweeted out June 8th UFC pay-per-view versus Gaethje, November UFC MSG versus Oliveira Arman, and then February 2025 versus anybody. So Islam has been very adamant about wanting to stay active, and he didn't pull that June date out of thin air. So my guess is there's probably some talking behind the scenes. And I even said recently, I thought that Islam Makhachev would fight Justin Gaethje next. And I think Charles Oliveira Arman Tsarukyan was promised the next title shot, but they weren't necessarily getting the next title shot, but they may get it in their next fight, if that makes sense. So, you can have Islam, who wants to be active. He can fight Justin Gaethje in June. You're going to have Oliveira Arman fighting in mid-April. They're not going to make that quick turnaround. It's going to be a 2-month turnaround, less than 2-month turnaround. You don't know how much damage they're going to come out of that fight with. So then you book Justin Gaethje in the next title shot in June, and then the winner of Oliveira versus Arman can then fight Islam somewhere around October, November, potentially in Abu Dhabi, potentially at Madison Square Garden, like Islam Makhachev suggests. And that's exactly what I think most likely happens. I think most likely the UFC makes the June date a pay-per-view. They put it in Saudi Arabia, and they headline it by Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje for the lightweight title. And I've always thought there has to be a title fight on the line in the main event of the UFC Saudi Arabia fight card, because it's just, they're so used to these extravagant events, and there's no way they're going to settle for less. I mean, they have so much money. They literally make Dana White and the owners of the UFC, they literally make them look poor. Look up the Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund. They have an unbelievable amount of money. That's why they're able to put on these crazy boxing cards, and they literally pay celebrities to show up to the cards. It's like one big party to them. So they're not going to accept a mediocre UFC Fight Night card. They'd rather tell the UFC, you know what? Let's hold off a couple months. You said already you're putting on a bunch of events, and that's why, you're running out of some talent maybe for this Fight Night card. Let's push it to June. Maybe we'll give you 30, 40 million instead of the 20 million and bring us a much better card. But I do think Dana White could take offense to that a little bit, to be honest. And also, where I do think this could change is, I do think the fact that Ariel Helwani reporting it could make this entire situation change. And I know that sounds crazy, but Dana White hates Ariel Helwani so much and wants to delegitimize him so much that I truly believe he is petty enough to make decisions based off of Ariel Helwani's reporting. So even if this is true, let's say Saudi Arabia and the UFC is going back and forth, deciding on what they're doing in June. Dana White sees that Ariel reported it. Now Dana White wants to make Ariel Helwani look like a bad reporter and make it look like fake news. So I could see Dana White scrambling around behind the scenes. Next thing you know, they announce a bunch of big fights for March 2nd, and we keep that March 2nd date in Saudi Arabia. Maybe all of a sudden they're calling up Islam Makhachev, who's been adamant about wanting to fight. They call up Justin Gaethje, who's going to be willing to take that opportunity, who's been training for that opportunity in March. They're going to call them up, and they're going to say, you know what? We want you to fight on March 2nd now. All of a sudden, Islam Makhachev is going to be 100% healthy, all because Dana White wants to prove Ariel Helwani wrong. And I know that sounds like a stretch, and I'm not necessarily predicting that. I think the most likely scenario is the Saudi Arabia card is moved till June. It'll probably be June 8th, like Islam Makhachev suggested. I think he got that date from somewhere. But I'm just saying, I would not be surprised if Dana White, behind the scenes, making a bunch of phone calls, trying to figure out a bunch of different things, all to put together a big card on March 2nd. But let's say, hypothetically, Islam Makhachev's banged up a little bit. You know, I know he's doing gymnastics. I know he's training spinning kicks on some dummies. But maybe he is a little bit banged up. Maybe he doesn't want to take a fight that early. What else do you have? There was rumors of Umar Nurmagomedov versus Corey Sandhagen. Supposedly, Corey Sandhagen isn't going to be 100% till about May. That's what Makhachev said online a couple weeks ago. So when you really start looking at those fights, you have Khamzat Chimaev coming off, I believe it was wrist or hand surgery. So you start looking at some of those big fights, and it's really hard to throw that together for the March 2nd date. So I really think the most likely scenario is the UFC moves it till June, makes it a pay-per-view, which would most likely be, so April will be 300, I guess May will be 301, and then June will be 302. So most likely UFC 302, we get like an Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje, co-main event, Khamzat Chimaev versus maybe like a Jarrett Cannonier, then featured fight on the card, Corey Sandhagen versus Umar Nurmagomedov, or another contender versus Umar Nurmagomedov. And I think they build a massive pay-per-view card for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia probably increases the amount of money they give to the UFC, and then kind of everyone leaves happy. The UFC's happy, Saudi Arabia's happy, and the fans are happy. And honestly, I think the next couple months watching the UFC, especially after UFC 299, is looking a little bleak. And I talked about this, you know, I love these stacked cards, but we end up with a lot of these mediocre cards, and we're going to end up with a bunch of mediocre cards in March. And I think the Saudi Arabia card was going to end up being mediocre. Right now, 8 out of 12 fights. Typically, there's 12 to 14 fights. So let's just say it's on the low end, 12 fights. Not really great fights. So you're going to have to announce 4 fights to save that card. And, you know, if you start looking around the roster right now, in terms of people who are healthy, it doesn't really add up who you could put on that card unless, and I don't know if Saudi Arabia thinks this would be a big fight as well because of the name value of both fighters, which isn't very big. You could maybe do Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad 2 for the welterweight title headlining that March 2nd date. And the UFC could maybe do that and then maybe find 1 or 2 other decent fights and then tell Saudi Arabia, look, you're getting a title fight. You get these couple other really decent fights and then we'll strike a deal for later this year. I think they have a multi-year deal with Saudi Arabia. So that is another possibility. You could also see an Islam Makhachev Justin Gaethje headliner for June. You could also see a co-main event of Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad too. But most of the rumors right now are kind of Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad happening at UFC 300, but that's not been confirmed yet either. So there's a lot of moving parts, but ultimately, I do believe we will get a big Saudi Arabia fight card in June. Whether it's a fight night card or a pay-per-view, I believe it will most likely be a pay-per-view, and I think the UFC will really stack it. And I do believe the headliner will be Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje. So in a way, I know people recently have been telling me, Joey, you were wrong about Saudi Arabia. It's not happening. If I end up being wrong, I'll be the first to admit it. I'll talk about it in a video, and we'll say, oh, you know, I was wrong on this. But it appears I might have been off on the date, but obviously these are things that are going on behind the scenes. But it appears to me, and I think the best educated guess is that the UFC is moving that March 2nd date to June to make it a pay-per-view and do Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje for the lightweight title as the headliner. We've even seen Ali Abdelaziz pushing that fight. Both of those guys are his clients. So that's something he's going to push for. He's buddies with the UFC. The UFC is going to want to make Saudi Arabia happy. And of course, they're going to want to have the Muslim champion in Islam Makhachev headlining a big card in Saudi Arabia, especially for their first card there. They want to make a big impact. They've done that time and time again, whether it be Abu Dhabi or when they first went to Madison Square Garden. They're going to want to put on a very big card. So I ultimately believe we get a big Saudi Arabia pay-per-view June 8th with Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje as the headliner. And I think it'll be a pretty exciting card, and I'm really looking forward to it. But as more details come out, I'll make other videos, so make sure you subscribe to the channel. Make sure you turn on the notifications. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.